In June 2022, American workers made an average of $27.45 per hour. In 1972, the same workers earned an average of $3.88 per hour. A chart like this might make it seem like America has come a long way in terms of wage growth. But when adjusted for inflation, wages have remained virtually unchanged over the last 50 years, with workers today earning just 12 cents more than they did in 1972.
When the average American is not seeing his or her living standards increase over a period of decades, that's something that should concern us all.
With inflation at its highest since 1981, Americans are feeling the pain of slow wage growth. 2/3 of American workers said that inflation has outpaced any salary gains made in the past year.
Now, because of the inflation, I can't even make the monthly payments. So I had to pick extra hours with my elderly care job.
But some economists argue that the concept is merely a myth that politicians use to promote their careers.
Politicians win elections by promising to fix something that is supposedly wrong in people's lives. And so I think there is a bit of a political cynicism and calculus involved in the wage stagnation debate and promises to fix the supposed problem.
So just how real is wage stagnation in America today? And what does it mean for American workers? Wages in America have stagnated since the early 1970s. But it was 1979 when the gap between workers' productivity and wage began to substantially increase. Between 1979 and 2020, workers' wages grew by 17.5%, while productivity grew over 3 times as fast at 61.8%.
It's not true that wages haven't grown at all. They have, but they haven't grown as quickly as they had in the past. Since the 80s, the economy's changed a lot. We've gone really from an industrial era to a tech era. When you have these big changes to the economy, sometimes the gains are not equally felt, but it really has an impact on everyone's lifestyle and everyone's wages.
Wage stagnation is worse for lower and middle income earners. The bottom 90% of American workers saw their annual wages increase by 28.2% from 1979 to 2020, while wages for the top 1% increased by 179.3%. Meanwhile, the top 0.1% saw an astonishing growth of 389.1%.
Real wages, which means that after we adjust them for inflation, has not risen that much since the late 1970s. We know that, on the other hand, inequality did rise over most of this period.
I've been working since the 90s when I came here. That's about 30 years on and off. And there was very little raise for domestic workers in general. Now, after the 2020 with the inflation, I feel like the income stayed the same. People lost some of the jobs, like in my experience, and we have to struggle to find different or secondary job or second part-time job just to maintain the monthly expenses of our daily living. It's very hard.
Despite causing severe disruption to the US labor market, the COVID pandemic has led to surprising wage gains across industries.
COVID has actually seen a significant acceleration in wage growth, particularly for low-wage earners. This reflects a really serious tightness in the labor market due to excessive U.S. demand, whether it's for the Federal Reserve or through fiscal stimulus payments, but also restrictions on labor supply, immigration restrictions, early retirements, and of course, illness or deaths. So that has driven substantial wage gains.
How to tell whether that's the new reality? And that's why I want to be cautious. It'll change our life forever, and maybe for the better in terms of labor market and wages. We have to wait and see.
Automation is one explanation for wage stagnation in America. The McKinsey Global Institute predicts that 45.3 million workers will lose their jobs due to advancements in technology by 2030.
Automation has been a really big factor so far in especially manufacturing jobs. So before, if you build a car, you use machines, but there was a lot of sort of hands-on work with it. Now, much more of that is done with machines, and you have to be a lot more skilled to use those machines, which means that a lot of the routine jobs have disappeared or they're very poorly paid.
Over the next 2 or 3 decades, a lot of economists believe that there's going to be a lot of disruption in the labor market because of new automation. And even college-educated workers, that financial assistance and accounting and even some parts of medical diagnoses will be done by machines with artificial intelligence. So a lot more of us might be facing that competition from these machines.
Globalization is another reason for wage stagnation, forcing domestic workers to compete against unfair competition.
And in a lot of countries, workers are paid a lot less. So now, particularly if you don't have a lot of very specialized skills, you're competing in that market. And that means that a lot of sort of routine office work and sort of manufacturing work is going to go overseas.
But that isn't all bad news for Americans.
It's important to remember that meant goods got a lot cheaper. It's one of the reasons we had such low inflation since the 80s, and everyone benefited from that. But that said, I think economists like me were a little cavalier that we saw the economy growing and people doing better about the people who were hurt. And we still don't really have good solutions to help people like that.
Economists suggest that labor dynamism also played a bigger role than expected. American workers today are changing jobs less frequently than before, even though job switching leads to strong take-home pay growth. While some Americans don't switch their jobs out of a desire for stability, others can't because there is nowhere else to go. In many local markets, companies use the lack of competition to suppress their workers' wages.
The notion of monopsony power is that you have a local labor market. Let's say that you live in a particular city or in a particular town, and in that town, there is one employer. And given that there is only one employer there, then they set the wages in a way that lower than what you would otherwise expect them to pay. This was a fully competitive market.
60% of US labor markets are considered highly concentrated, meaning a few employers are competing for local workers. Just 10% more workers in an area can lead to about a 1% reduction in posted wages.
I've asked a couple families over the years, that was still before Corona, for a $10 raise, and they just declined. They said they'll find somebody cheaper, and we practically lost the job.
In case after case, you see that government policies were implemented to discourage labor dynamism and to discourage workers from moving to a better job or moving to a better town or city to improve their job prospects. And this inevitably will weigh on wage growth over time.
Companies can also play a direct role in stifling the competition with methods like non-compete agreements. Roughly half of private sector US businesses that responded to the EPI survey said at least some of their employees are in non-compete agreements, meaning some 36 to 60 million private sector workers in America are subject to non-compete agreements.
The non-compete clause would lead you to stay with your current employer, not to move, because that the consequences would be that it would be more difficult for you to find employment. And if you are less likely to leave the job, you'll be tied in or locked into the current employer, which means that the likelihood that that employee would keep getting his or her lower earning is much higher. The rationale for it at the very high end of the income distribution of the skill set. But, I don't see much of a reason to have it for rank and file employees.
Meanwhile, unions that originally fought for higher compensation have drastically lost its power over the years. Union membership in the US fell from 20% of American workers in 1983 to just 10.3% in 2021. Workers in unions typically earn higher wages, about 10.2% more compared to similar non-union workers, thanks to methods such as collective bargaining.
In those industries where unionization stayed somewhat high, the effect of market power or monopsony of the employer on wages was muted. So the unions were able to bargain on behalf of the employees even when they were dealing with large employers, so wages were less stagnant or didn't decline as much.
But some suggest that wage stagnation is an issue blown way out of proportion.
The issue we have in the wage stagnation debate is that a lot of researchers have been using a certain inflation metric, the consumer price index, that really dramatically overstates inflation over time. So if you look at 2 periods, you see that those expenses per CPI have gone up far more than they actually have. That makes it seem like your wage increase is much smaller than it really actually is. You're actually able to buy a lot more with your nominal wage than these researchers say you can. So that's why most researchers, including the Federal Reserve, like to use a different measure of inflation, the personal consumption expenditures, or PCE. The PCE shows a much more moderate inflation over the last several decades. When you apply PCE to nominal wage growth, you discover much higher wage growth for middle income workers. In other words, no wage stagnation at all, and in fact, a pretty nice gain over the last 30 years.
Focusing on broad national data over individual experiences can create another issue.
They see, the percentage of low wage professions has increased, therefore, we have wage stagnation or decline. What they don't do is they don't actually look at the people in those professions and what their wages have done over time. So, for example, you can have someone who is a janitor who works for 30 years and actually made substantial increases in wages and earnings over that time. That would be lost if you just look at janitors overall.
I think it is technically a myth, and I think it is overblown. To say that people aren't better off than they were in the 70s is just patently absurd. I think everything about our lifestyle and our living standards are higher, and even our real wages are technically higher. But I think there is something to the fact that wages aren't growing as fast as they used to for most people. So people don't feel like they're equally sharing the same prosperity. And I think that is a problem that's leading to a lot of social unrest.
Legislation could help solve some of the biggest issues causing wage stagnation in America.
There is a limited amount that we can do through policy when you have big changes in technology, globalization, forces like that. But policy can matter a lot.
For instance, things like those non-competes. I think that's adding to wage stagnation. And, you shouldn't have such a non-competes, particularly for low-skilled jobs.
We could pass legislation to make it easier for workers to unionize. There was a bill called the PRO Act, Protect Our Right to Organize, that the House of Representatives has already passed. It's dead in the water in the Senate.
I think we also really need to embrace more of the gig market, which so far I feel like we're trying to sort of pretend doesn't exist and make it sort of a lower tier part of the labor market. But if we sort of allow those platforms to offer health insurance, then I think it could become better quality jobs that are more dynamic and let people get more of the upside risk and not just the downsides.
The rise of remote work could also be beneficial to wage growth in local markets.
Some employers are very happy to have their employees working remotely. In a way, if you can work remotely, at least, when you think about monopsony power, you are diminishing the monopsony power of an employer, because that if you are a talented person, even if you are in a small town where there's only one or two large employers, you can work for a global firm that can be based in any other part of the world or the US and work remotely and earn a higher wage.
Achieving a fair wage for all Americans is vital in ensuring the success of the American economy.
There's a basic, not just a basic sense of fairness. There is something historically we have called the American dream. It attracts immigrants to our shores. It motivates all kinds of people to innovate and make the economy productive. And wages, really, in some ways, are a reflection of the productivity and skills of American workers. So if wages are stagnating for a whole bunch of people, that means that we are not becoming as productive a country as we can be. That means the whole economy is not working as well as it can be.